Good morning. Oh, I'm still not used. Are you okay? Can you hear me if I do this? I really don't like microphones. I don't really like microphones that much. Good, great to see all of you here this morning. I hope you enjoyed yourselves last night and this evening. All right, and it's becoming somewhat of a later evening, so I'm so glad to see so many people here this morning. And we have a full program today. I'm going to have some logistical information later, but let's have more fun into the heart of the matter. I would like to introduce to you my boss, the president of the college, Dr. Colson, and he's going to share a few words of welcome and talk a little bit about why it makes so much sense to have the 1848er conference here at Wartburg. So I'm going to be quiet because if you get me started, you can't get me done. So I'll turn over to you. Darrel Colson.
I think I'm worse than Dan. Thank you all for being here. I'm actually worse than Dan. I think once I get started, it's hard to get me to stop too. But I really am delighted that you're here. I guess it was about 3 or 4 years ago that I met Yogi Reppmann and learned about his interest in the topic of the 1848ers, and we have become friends and colleagues over that time. It's a wonderful thing for us to be able to host you at this conference this year. I want to remind you of some of the comments that Mark Schlinker, the honorary consul, made last night during the award ceremony about the German heritage in Iowa. But I want specifically to talk about Wartburg College. Our German heritage is dear to us, and it is a part of the fiber of our being. Some of the stories he was telling last night reminded me of stories about our own past, and I'm just going to touch on a couple of the topics so you'll understand how deeply loyal we are to that German heritage we have. It was only about 100 years ago that we decided to start teaching in English at the college. But the interesting thing about that is that none of our faculty knew enough English actually to teach courses in English. And so we sent one of our faculty members off to a state university to learn enough English so that he could then come back and start a parallel curriculum in the English language. Now, by the 1920s, the whole curriculum was being taught in English except for specifically German language courses. It is true that that law that was passed during World War I here in the state forbidding the speaking of German in public was a hindrance to us. And there is a story about one of our college presidents who preached a sermon in a church here in Iowa in German, because otherwise the people in the congregation would not have understood the sermon. And he was, in fact, called up by local authorities. And there's a famous story about an attorney in town who had quite a bit of clout statewide going to Des Moines to spring our president. But the fact that sense of loyalty, a sense of heritage, a sense of fealty to that German tradition is so strong was manifested last night by that gathering of Eisenachers who joined you for dinner. I have a feeling you didn't know why in the world all those people were showing up for dinner with you. There's a delegation of about 22 people from the city of Eisenach here as a part of a sister city celebration. That too is an indication of this sense of heritage we have. We had always felt a kind of affection for the Wartburg, the castle that overlooks Eisenach. But during the DDR days, it was very difficult for us to get there. I think we heard a little bit about that last night, about how difficult it is to do research. Was to do research in Thuringen during DDR days. It was very difficult for us to get there. We would take our choir with great difficulty to Eisenach so that they could see the castle, but because our choir's repertoire includes sacred music, they were not allowed to sing in the castle during DDR days. And that was always a handicap and a hindrance to us. The moment that the Iron Curtain fell, Wartburg College president and the mayor of Waverly, Les Zelli, were there because they wanted to establish a relationship with Eisenach. So Waverly and Eisenach are sister cities. Wartburg College and Die Wartburg have an agreement of cooperation that have been in force now since the Iron Curtain fell. That's why last night we were celebrating this 20th anniversary of the sister-city relationship. Another interesting story, there are a lot of interesting stories around Wartburg, but Les Zelli, who was our mayor in the early 1990s, had himself been in the U.S. Army in 1944-45. So he had been in Eisenach when the war ended. He, in fact, was among the soldiers, the American soldiers, who turned over Thuringen to the Soviet Red Army. And so Les, you can imagine, always deep in his heart, wanted to get back there, wanted to restore a relationship that he felt had been broken. So for us, this heritage that you're here to help us understand and that you study is very much a part of who we are. In a couple of weeks, we're going to dedicate an endowed chair, a distinguished endowed chair in Lutheran heritage and mission. And again, pointing back to that heritage we share with the Germans, with the Lutheran Church, with the castle, with Eisenach, and with all of those wonderful immigrants who came here in the 1840s and 1850s, for whom this school was in fact founded. This school was founded by missionaries to educate the children of the immigrants that you study. So the fact that you're here is very appropriate for us and for our history and for our heritage. I am so glad you're here. And I think, as I mentioned before, I have a tendency to talk a bit too long. I'm going to get out of your way now, but I just want you to know that you are more than welcome on our campus today and any day. We hope you view it as another home and come back early and often. And we are glad you're here for the next couple of days and hope you learn a lot from one another. So Dan, let me turn over the floor to one of you two guys.
I had all my notes of what I needed to say, but that's okay. Not very many. Once again, I wanted to extend a welcome. I'm so excited to have you all here. And as I mentioned to some of you earlier, it's actually a pleasure now to have a face that goes along with his email address, or just a signature at the bottom. So it really is a pleasure to meet all of you. And just meeting you and talking about it. I was excited before the conference was going to begin with the panels. Now having met all of you and talked with all of you, it's even going to be better than I ever expected. So don't disappoint me, no pressure. Okay? Just a few logistics. If you look in your program, we're in two rooms. Today we're going to be mainly in this room, okay? But we sometimes have some double sessions, and we'll have one or two double sessions tomorrow. The other one, it says it's in the Heritage Ballroom. I believe now it's the Knights Ballroom. If it's for me, I'm not here. Okay. It's in the Knights Ballroom. It's right next door, and you have in the back of your program, there's actually a map there, and it's pretty much where we ate dinner last night, for those of you who were able to be here with dinner. Know about the shuttle. What else? I know I'm forgetting something. Oh, I know some of you, because of your academic status, you're receiving some support from us. I actually emailed those of you for whom we haven't already directly paid for some of your bills, a form for you to fill out, and you can actually fill it out and then email it to me if you want to after you complete it. I do, though, need original receipts. I do strongly urge you to make copies of those receipts. Like every institution of higher learning, there is a bureaucracy. Ours is not as big as larger institutions. Sometimes things do get misplaced. It is rare, but it's always good to have that backup. And I know some people are just going to give me the receipts now, fill out that form, and send it to me. I know there may be one or two people that might need it as an international bank transfer. And for those who need it, I think, Daniel, does that apply to you? Do you need to do an international bank transfer? Yeah. Okay, I have a special form for you also. You can fill out another form. Wonderful. Yeah, but it's actually because the bank's in control is required, and they have to have all these details. If you have any questions about any of that, please do come see me. I will be more than happy to help you. And I don't think there's any others, but if I do, we're going to be seeing each other a few other times. I'll announce them. Oh, I do need to point something out that we didn't fully do last night. Yogi indicated that we have to reveal to you who actually did an amazing job with the decorations at the tables, and also at the table, at the registration table outside, and then also, more importantly, at the dinner table. Does anyone know who that was? I'll give you 5,000 points if you get it right.
You did.
No. Oh, okay. I'm taking away 5,000 points from you.
God.
It was his wife, Scott Christensen's wife, Andrea, and she did an amazing job. Let's not. She's sleeping. She's recovering because she worked so hard. She worked so hard. So when you see her, please do thank her. She did an amazing job. And really, I think, just the decorations themselves epitomize, I think, what this conference is all about. Not just in terms of the subject matter, but in terms of the delegates that are here, but also it blends very nicely, as President Colson also pointed out, very nicely with what we are as an institution. All right? Enough from me, and I'm going to turn it over to Yogi because I wanted to keep it short because he'll want more time. Okay? Everyone knows Yogi. I don't think he needs any introduction. All right? And he's going to share a few words of wisdom, some surprises, and... Oh, it's right here. Yeah, the session will be, there is a session right after this one as well, and we'll get that going, but Yogi's going to share a few words of wisdom, a few important announcements as well, a few highlights, and some wonderful events, right?
How do you like his tie?
Now try not to mix this up, okay? Try not to. I know it'll be difficult.
The heavy two dingbats here.
That's right.
Thank you very much, Dan. Talking about 1848, my story started in 1978 in Devonport in the Putnam Museum. There were two surprises, two men, Hans Reimer Clausen and his son-in-law Christian Müller, who founded the Socialistic Turnverein 1857 in Devonport, Iowa. Klaus Lemke-Petzing, my high school buddy. Klaus, just wave so we know who you are. And I wrote on my birthday, actually that night, March 27th, some moons ago, this little brochure. And then Jan Jessen translated it all night into Danish. And we had an English translation, so everybody who does not have that copy, feel free to pick up one copy over here or at the registration table. Out of this essay, Scott Christiansen and his wife, who did the decoration, is Frau Schröder. So we just talk about Frau Schröder and not Carol. Was inspired, and I asked him also many moons ago, please write a biography about Christian Müller from his hometown Devonport, because Christian Müller not only had founded the Sozialistischer Turnverein in Devonport with the motto freedom, education and well-being for all, but also became an owner of a lumber company. And the son of Christian Müller's brother came to Flensburg, my hometown, did not go to Devonport, Iowa, and started a lumber company in Flensburg. And Klaus and I went to high school with Georg Müller and Frauke Müller. At the same time, we graduated with them from high school. And George is now running the Müller Lumber Company in Flensburg, Schleswig-Holstein, Germany. So for many, many generations, there was a Müller Lumber Company in Devonport and Flensburg, very closely related. That closely that Georg Müller, the guy with Klaus and I graduated from high school in Germany, did an internship in 1983 with Bill Müller at the Müller Lumber Company in Devonport. That shows how close the relationships, the contacts, the family ties are. Talking about giving Scott Christiansen a job. He started writing a huge biography about Christian Müller, middle of April, computer virus. Even though he had saved everything in the iCloud with a professional company, everything was destroyed the last year of his research and so on. And a specialist company in Wisconsin who works together with CIA, FBI, and they work on these little pieces which were found at the Twin Towers in New York City to resurrect hard drives and so on, could not help Scott. So, but Scott did not give up, but he could not finish the Müller biography, but in an appendix to his Müller biography, he had written 66 pages about Wilhelm von Schirach. And I liked the appendix so much that 4 weeks ago I said, Scott, the Müller book is great, but please develop your appendix 5, the Wilhelm von Schirach story, which he named The Forgotten 48er, into a book. So he did, and just in a way, hours ago, Scott had finished The Forgotten 48er, the Wilhelm von Schirach story. You see even an exhibition of our favorite pages. The book can be ordered kind of through me. We still need the hardbound version and so on, but in case you have an interest, you write an email and we work on the details. I personally think this will be a college textbook because German studies has a future. Teaching German in high schools, in colleges is an uphill battle. Chinese and other Spanish is high on emotion here in America, and German is hard to sell. But German studies, transatlantic studies, all that, this would be an ideal and will be an ideal textbook. Thank you, Scott, for having that. So if you have So talking about the Stoltenberg Institute, Stoltenberg was a fatherly friend, a very successful governor in Schleswig-Holstein. He gave money to my early trips in 1978 and 1982 to do research here in the Midwest. And he became a Secretary of Finances and was very close to be Chancellor of West Germany. That was his dream. And as a PhD historian, he and I often talked about 1848. In 1976, as a governor, he was invited to the governor in Wisconsin, so he had many trips to America. And as a very young politician in 1952, he met Henry Kissinger, who was teaching in his first semester history at Harvard. So there are many reasons for my thankfulness to name this institute Stoltenberg. And Carl Fink, where is Carl? Had an idea early September, after Gerald and I came back. He said, well, Yogi, before you look for a building and donations and so on, even though we have now a building in Davenport, let's start the institute like a Hall of Fame as a digital institute, and we even have started already with the first yearbook. Thank you, Carl. This is a wonderful concept. It's so easy nowadays, actually. And Carl, as an IT wizard and Goethe expert, had the right track. So this is the situation. 1848 is not only history. We had many talks how timeless and how timely Karl Schurz had talked about immigration. We will do more of that. So please feel invited. All of you will be in the advisory board, hopefully, for our new Stoltenberg 1848 Institute. We will start immediately, I think, with the first session, because we have wonderful German-American scholars who think about a lot how much we can take concepts from the 1848ers for a bright future of Germany and America.
Before we begin, I found my list.
Good.
A couple things I forgot. First of all, I need to make a public announcement. If I don't always have the information in front of me, I can be really bad with names. And I need to apologize to Scott and to his wife. I called her by the wrong name, and I really do apologize for that. I know.
Call her Frau Schröder.
Yeah, Frau Schröder.
Frau Schröder.
Okay.
With a rolling R there.
Okay. Okay. And if you're really nice to her, she may even knit you a scarf. She does a wonderful job knitting. She does a wonderful job. And I do want to publicly apologize that I made that mistake. I know her name. And just the other thing is I wanted to point out is that this afternoon and tomorrow afternoon you're at lunch on your own. There is a sheet out there at the registration table. If you did not get it yet, there are several locations on campus. If you have questions, you can be pointed in the right direction. If you want to get off campus, there's many places within walking distance. If you have a car, you can go down to the burgeoning metropolis of downtown Waverly. Also, I'm joking, population 9,000. Anyway, there's that as well. And tonight, for those of you who are coming to the dinner, we are actually going to be basically up there in the castle room, okay? Now, some of you were there when you arrived that Saturday evening. That's where we had a reception. And in terms of logistics, that should be it. We're a little ahead of schedule, which is actually rather amazing for an academic conference. And so Yogi had the suggestion, and I think it's a brilliant one, that we can actually have some more time maybe for lunch as well, is if we can begin the session now, if the presenters are ready to do that. Now we have Martin, Daniel, and David. Are you ready? You want to go early? Or do you still need time to work on your paper? And Yogi's actually the moderator. He's going to be doing introductions, but I don't know if you need to do anything technical, if you need to load anything. Daniel, do you need anything technical?
No, I don't need to
load. Okay. Question, the people behind the curtain. I love the Wizard of Oz reference. Do you turn this on, or do we turn it? You turn it on. Excellent. I'm not sure who's going to need it. So Yogi, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and this one to be logistics.
Mein Freund, Herr Bellermann, läuft weg, wenn es informativ und bildungspolitisch wichtig wird.
I will repeat my sentence. If I listen too long to you, Yogi, and if you speak 10 minutes more, then we will give back Schleswig-Holstein to Denmark.
That's the ultimate punishment here. Then Jan and I will have the same nationality, whatever that means. The first session, we have three wonderful, really, scholars.
We're going to do a break because some people will probably think 9:45. So we need to actually.
We have a break, yes. Or
in honor of the Germans,
maybe.
we will stick to the schedule. And others that are doing that. So take a moment, stand up, talk, whatever you want to do. There's still refreshments out there.
Let's have a good time. We have a situation that we can talk with Scott and his breakfast in Glücksburg, where he got a newspaper, and he took a toilet lid back home from that trip. A Danish toilet lid.
Oh, I went with this story.
Any questions or remarks?
We do have time, seriously, we do have about 40 minutes before we, so Phil, please feel free. You never know how long some events will take, and so we built in a little bit of cushion, so please just get up.
Wunderbar, moin moin. We have three stunningly, excessively good-looking scholars from Germany and from America. We are very glad to have them because this German-American presentation with human beings, with visitors, adds a wonderful atmosphere to Wartburg College Waverly. Please welcome these three men with a very, very warm and hearty applause. I start with the American. Dave and I met on March 24th, 1848, March 24th, 2013, but 1848 was the reason. Gid and I were invited to give a talk in the German American Heritage Center in Devonport, and in Devonport there is a festivity commemorating the book of Martin Rackwitz. Well, the revolution in Schleswig-Holstein and Kiel had started March 24th, 1848, and 2013, March 24th, there was a nice event. That's how Dave and I had met. And Dave immediately said, well, Yogi, 1848 is not only history. Let's talk about how can we use these timeless and timely concepts, moral values of the 48ers for today and for future activities in Germany and America. So this is the step to the next book. The Revolution March in Kiel, 1848, Martin Rackwitz, the expert in Germany about 1848 and the revolution, wrote a wonderful book lately about Kiel, the capital of the state of Schleswig-Holstein, where many of us in Schleswig-Holstein went to university, and the man who gave money for this conference, who's coming later this afternoon, Klaus Peter Köln, a urologist in Cedar Rapids, retired. He will come with his son Thies. You would pronounce the name Thies, T-H-I-E-S, a North European name. So we are really happy to have Klaus Peter this afternoon with us. So 1848, Kiel leads to Daniel Nagel. We started contact because of the conference, I think, and it was fascinating. Daniel Nagel is a representative of young scholars in America and Germany who are lately doing a lot of research about 1848, and he made us aware that there's a lady from New Zealand, Alison Effort, who is now in Milwaukee, a lady from New Zealand. I think they have 3 million inhabitants and 50 million sheep, came to America doing research about transatlantic questions. Wonderful research. Dan made me aware that there is an amazing group of American, New Zealand, and German scholars. So Dan will start with a fascinating topic. I gave his fairly expensive PhD dissertation to several friends about 1848ers as democratic Republicans or Republicans with democratic concepts. Thank you, Daniel, for coming. You have the stage here.
Yeah, thank you very much, Yogi, and thanks, Professor Walther, for having me. It's so nice to be at a conference where everyone knows what the 48ers are. At the last conference, I had 2 pages on explaining on who they are, actually, and what they were doing. But just making sure the 48ers were a group of German revolutionaries, of radical Republicans who wanted to turn Germany into a republic during the revolution of 1848. And there's a long story connected to that, but the result is pretty clear, and that the result was failure. And eventually these 48ers had to flee Germany and went first to Switzerland and then to the United Kingdom mostly, and then eventually to the United States. And the 48ers had several things in common, actually, that justifies calling them a unified group. They had risked their life, their property, and their occupation on creating a German republic. They also shared the experience of defeat, and they also shared the experience of life in exile. But most importantly, they shared a common ideology, republicanism. Most 48ers firmly believed that republicanism offered a blueprint for a good society. To the 48ers, republicanism meant the absence of monarchical rule and government by the people or their representatives. The 48ers advocated a democratic republicanism, which is the topic of my talk, that guaranteed the human rights of all people. In economic terms, republicanism called for government intervention into the marketplace to help all citizens to achieve independence and prosperity, including the lower classes. And independence, as we'll notice, is a classical theme in republicanism, because only the independent citizen can has the necessary abilities to judge freely and come to the right conclusions. If people in a republic were truly free and equal, independent citizens could participate in a democratic political process and engage in an open discourse on any given matter. In this worldview, the United States served as a model of republicanism. The 48ers admired the Constitution of the United States, the Declaration of Independence, and the Founding Fathers, whom they considered to be exemplary embodiments of republican virtue. In the very beginning of their life in exile, the 48ers faced a lot of uncertainty. They knew very much about the history of the early history of the American Republic, especially the War of Independence, but they knew very little about the then present state of America. They spoke little or no English and had to adapt to life in exile in a very short time. The German 48ers also faced a very different situation in the exiles from other countries. Unlike them, the German immigration was very extensive. More than 1 million Germans immigrated to the United States between 1850 and 1859. So the German 48ers made a part of the German folk that they claimed to fight for in Germany, in the United States. Also, when the 48ers looked at the American society in the early 50s, they were very dissatisfied and quickly realized that the American Republic did not live up to their expectations. They criticized American materialism and the excessive influence of religion in the public sphere. They also attacked the political parties, Democrats and Whigs, which they thought to suffer from a lack of principled positions. And then there was the most important problem, which was slavery. The 48ers' critique of slavery rested on the assertion that slavery corrupted the virtuous citizen, which was so crucial to good Republican government. Slavery denied human rights, especially freedom and equality, of course, and the 48ers believed that if slavery was not abolished, it would eventually destroy the Republic. Instead of enabling people to participate in a free Republican society as equals, slavery denied the slaves basic human rights and treated them as property, although they were undoubtedly human. Because human rights constitute the foundation of any political freedom of any civilization of the present century, the German 48er Christian Esselin wrote, we must demand equal rights for the Negro, as for ourselves, not for the sake of the Negro, but for our own sake, for the sake of our own civilization. The slavery issue was especially galling to the ultra-radical 48er Karl Heinzen, who insisted on the equality of all men, regardless of race or gender. He hated slavery because, in his words, it destroyed republicanism. And he placed the hope in the fact that the United States was still a democratic republic, which means that the people themselves could enact the necessary change, the necessary reforms in the United States. And the best means to achieve that was to have an open discourse on the problems that slavery caused. The problem with that, of course, was only that Heinzen spoke, in the beginning at least, very little English, and had no means of reaching the American population. So the solution that he took was quite obvious, and he and other 48ers turned to the newly arrived and to the older German immigrants that were in the United States. And starting in 1851, actually, Karl Heinzen advocated forming a German organization in the United States that would imbue the American political system with a freedom-loving German spirit. So this concept is a kind of strange concept for us today, but at that time, it turned out to be pretty popular among the 48ers. So the idea was that Heinzen regarded the German spirit as an expression of truth, freedom, humanity, and progress, and he argued that it had its place in every free society. And this highly flexible and really abstract concept allowed him to define the mission for the German immigrants in the United States. And he made the fight against slavery the centerpiece of his agenda. He called for the abolition of the fugitive slave law, the ban on spreading of slavery into new territories, and gradual abolition of slavery where it already existed. Heinzen was not blind to the fact that German immigrants could not succeed on their own. He suggested that a German organization, often called German Party, should try to form an alliance with an American party to instill the German spirit directly into the political system. Heinzen emphasized that this process had to happen within the limits set by the American Constitution. The German organization was never supposed to exist on its own terms, but to participate in a realignment of the political parties of that time. Heinzen was important because he demonstrated how the German 48ers could participate in American politics without abandoning their ethnic identity. He showed that the 48ers' American exile could have a purpose and a meaning. German Americans had an important mission to fulfill by fighting the corrupting influence of Southern slavery on the American Republic. And the exiles also did not have to wait for the outbreak of a German revolution. They could fight for the progress of freedom right in the United States. And if they were successful, that would have a positive effect on the cause of freedom worldwide. The German-American identity that Heinzen invented rested upon two pillars, and that was the already ethnic identity of the German immigrants, who Heinzen considered to be a unified group, despite the fact that they were divided among regional and religious lines. The second pillar was his fervent belief in republicanism as the best hope to liberate not only Americans or Europeans, but eventually people all over the world. The basic tenets of this republicanism were freedom and equality. Heinzen's conviction that Germans had to play the role of freedom fighters in American politics was not widely accepted at first, but quickly gained ground among other 48ers. The situation, though, was very different with the older immigrants who really disliked this idea and considered themselves to be merely United States citizens, and in a very strange expression, they call themselves Vereinigte Staaten Bürger, which is awkward even in German, but to make it even more awkward, they abbreviated the Vereinigte Staaten into VER dot Staatenbürger, which reads really strange, but that was the term that these older Germans gave themselves, especially the very influential New Yorker Staatszeitung, back then the largest German newspaper in the world, including German. And the editor of the New Yorker Staatszeitung was a man called Gustav Adolf Neumann, whom Heinzen attacked as a degenerate German. The Staatszeitung and all the other established newspapers that failed to support Heinzen's concept were corrupted by slavery and mere servants of American parties, especially the slavery-friendly Democratic Party. And worst of all, they did not even write proper German. The result was a major conflict that lasted several years and caused lasting bitterness between the Greys, the older immigrants, and the Greens, the newer ones, the 48ers. It is hard to overestimate the aggressiveness of the 48ers' attack on the Greys. This conflict had important political repercussions. Until the arrival of the 48ers, the German Americans almost exclusively voted for the Democratic Party. There were a few wealthy Germans who supported the Whigs, but the Whigs had almost no popular support among the Germans at large, because they were widely to be considered the party of the American middle class. The 48ers challenged that worldview. Very few ended up supporting the Whigs, already quite visibly a party in decline, but they argued that Germans should look for new alliances, especially the emergence of a party of freedom, in German Allgemeine Freiheitspartei, which would take on the hated Democratic Party, which was of course in bed with Southern slavery. The 48ers eventually succeeded in redefining the political allegiance of the German Americans. This was due to their sheer determination, their larger numbers, and their skills as political agitators. Their interpretation of Germanness became commonplace, but the debate on how to stay true to the ethnic identity while being engaged in American politics never waned. Instead, the 48ers spent much of the 1850s arguing how to reconcile party politics and the need for Germans to stay true to their commitment to freedom and equality. And I want to talk about this in a little bit more detail. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 forced many older German immigrants to reconsider their allegiance to the Democratic Party. The threat of slavery expansion into the vast territories of the West frightened and angered many immigrants who widely considered the law to be an attempt to bolster the South in American slavery. And as a result, many of the older Germans also joined the newly founded Republican Party, which was at that time, in the very beginning, a radical anti-slavery party. This was especially important in the election of 1856, which had the 48ers being infatuated with the Republican Party for a short while. Never was the enthusiasm of the 48ers for an American political party as great as in 1856. Old revolutionary heroes like Friedrich Hecker emerged to tell the German Americans to vote for the Republican Party. Even after they lost the election, the mood was rather upbeat. The Republican Party, for a brief time, looked to be just the tool that the 48ers had waited for all these years. The reason was that the Republican platform of 1856 and the Germans' love party platforms was so radical. It even appealed to Karl Heinzen, who was the arch-radical, because it condemned slavery as barbarism and contained several statements that could be understood as endorsing federal intervention to secure the rights of the Declaration of Independence to all people, including the slaves. While the platform actually limited this language to fight the introduction of slavery into new territories, Karl Heinzen concluded that it enabled government to intervene on the side of freedom and equality against slavery where it already existed. The Philadelphia platform provided a blueprint for federal anti-slavery policy, even if it was not intended as such. And it also gave the fight against slavery a positive meaning, because it talked about how to secure the human rights of people to all people. And that was crucial to someone like Christian Esselin, who said we must not be only the anti-slavery party, we also have to have a positive message. The 48ers rejected warnings that this policy endangered the Union. The survival of the Union itself was not important to them. Important to them was that the Union was a union with freedom and equality. If the Union survived, but if slavery was dominated by slavery, it would be worthless. Several aspects very soon complicated this ideal picture of the Republican Party as this ideal anti-slavery party. In the mid-1850s, a wave of nativism swept the United States, as you all know, and the 48ers and many German immigrants were suddenly under attack. Bloody riots in many cities broke out, and immigrants and nativists killed each other in the streets. For the 48ers, these were deeply shocking and confusing events. And at first, because they downplayed the violence, because they considered it to be anti-Catholic, something which they very largely approved of. But they soon found out that the American nativists also attacked the 48ers themselves as being infidels. Especially the 48ers considered nativism to be a distraction in the larger fight against slavery. And they really resented. Although the wave of nativist violence soon subsided, nativist sentiment continued to linger on much longer. Politically, the nativists of the North had no other party to turn to but the Republican Party, because the nativist party soon collapsed. And this diluted the 48ers' vision as this pure anti-slavery party. They said, well, how can you fight against slavery but also want to limit the rights of the immigrants? And of course, this gave some older German immigrants an opening who had stayed true to the Democratic Party and who said, well, how can you lead the Germans, how can you Republican Germans, how can you lead them into the fold of a party that is undoubtedly nativist? The 48ers, although stayed true to the Republican Party mostly and stressed that nativism was an aberration and reminded the Republican Party over and over again that it had to get rid of it and that it should not take the German votes for granted. Some argued even that the Germans should found a new party that should interact and talk and negotiate with the Republican Party in forming an alliance, but eventually, this shows how predominant the thought of the freedom-loving freedom-loving Germans had become. Germans being German and being for freedom was virtually the same for these people. The more realistic 48ers pointed out that a separate German party would basically enable the Democrats to win all elections, so they pressed the Republican Party to guarantee the rights of the immigrants. The Republican Party went a long way to accommodate the Germans because they did not want to lose these votes as a conflict between North and South was approaching. The slaveholders, on the other hand, were also firmly convinced that the Republican institutions of the South depended on the existence of slavery. In fact, Southern slaveholders promoted a diametrically opposed form of republicanism, a republicanism of slavery that directly was on a collision course with the 48ers' republicanism of freedom. The slaveholders demanded that the federal government protect slavery. The 48ers argued just the other way around, and they demanded the extension of the free labor republicanism to the South. So this was kind of an aggressive idea because it it would not leave the South alone, as some advocated, but it would really transform it into a new kind of society. For instance, Karl Schurz explained how this concept and how the standard of republicanism was supposed to work. And he said about the Republican platform of 1860 that it had the goal to lift the creed of the party far above the level of mere oppositional policy. The platform gives it a positive character. The Republicans stand before the country not only as the anti-slavery party, but emphatically as the party of free labor. While penning up slave labor within the limits which the legislation of states has assigned to it, we propose to plant free labor in the territories by the Homestead Bill and to promote free labor over the land by the encouragement of home industry. In throwing its shield over the eternal principles of human rights, the platform presents the anti-slavery policy of the party in its logical connections with the great material interests of the country. To man, his birthright; to labor, freedom; to him that wants to labor, work and independence; to him that works, his dues. This is the Republican platform. This statement shows how crucial republicanism was to the 48ers' ideology. It rested on human rights and economic independence, which the 48ers aimed to create with the system of free labor. Free labor doesn't mean just wage labor. It means it is actually a broad concept. It includes human rights for everyone. And this free labor society would serve as the basis of a really Republican society. Nevertheless, although there were so many similarities between the 48ers and the Republican Party at large, they did not give the Republicans the benefit of the doubt in 1860 as they had done in 1856. They demanded concessions and protections against nativism, and they achieved that goal in the Republican platform that was adopted at the convention in Chicago in 1860. The German 48ers also pressed for a candidate who was free of any nativist inclinations, and they achieved that with Abraham Lincoln, who was also very much a very strong anti-slavery man. Abraham Lincoln was not a radical in any sense of the word, but he was a radical anti-slavery man. So what happened was that the German 48ers supported the Republican Party in 1860 and also tried to get the German Americans to support the party too. Their success actually varied from state to state. In Illinois, ironically, it may have been decisive. It certainly wasn't overall decisive, but it was significant because the German vote suddenly was in play. For a long time, the German vote was almost exclusively Democratic, and now suddenly Germans considered voting for other parties, which certainly gave them much more political influence. I want to close by talking about democratic republicanism a little bit, which envisioned the liberation of peoples everywhere from oppression. Ideally, that was not limited to one country, but eventually people all over the world would be liberated, and the world of monarchies, which was very much the case in the 1850s, would be turned into a world of republics. Before this, however, could be achieved, the American Republic had to free itself from slavery, because the United States were the greatest example of republicanism that was present in the world, and if it was not able to rid itself of slavery, there was basically no hope that any other country would achieve that. By constantly stressing the need for American society to confront and eventually eliminate slavery, the 48ers participated in a major realignment of American parties. The German-American followers added crucial votes to the Republican Party, which enabled the 48ers to gain influence and promote their belief that slavery posed the greatest challenge to the perfection of republicanism. When the Civil War broke out, the 48ers actually welcomed the conflict and supported the cause of the Union because they were convinced that the military struggle between North and South had to end in the abolition of slavery. And, of course, one step closer to the perfection of republicanism. In the opinion of the 48ers, the victory of the North would ensure that the American Republic would fulfill its world historic mission of promoting freedom and equality worldwide. in a not too distant future, people everywhere around the world would imitate that. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. We have Dave Ellis from the Quad Cities, and one part is called Bettendorf in Iowa. Thank you for coming, and we are excited.
Thank you very much. Most of the papers at this conference focus on the contribution of German refugees who fled the failed revolution of 1848 and brought political views and practices that enriched and deepened the notions of freedom and the rule of law in the United States, and bully for them. But I would like to focus in this paper on something rather different, namely the ways in which some of those who had most to do with the crushing of the revolution in 1848 recast concepts such as freedom, legality, and the role of the Constitution in Prussia. In particular, I would like to focus on two factions, among many, of conservatives who divided over precisely such questions. In examining why they split, I hope to establish two things. First, I hope to show that these opponents of the more liberal 1848ers thought of themselves as offering, in a self-interested but not merely self-serving way, an ethically superior notion of freedom than the notion offered by revolutionaries. Second, I hope to establish that for at least some of these factions, there were genuinely liberal principles, though certainly not democratic or revolutionary ones, that undergirded their views. One can only wonder what such peculiar alliances might have developed between conservatives and those who were expelled or fled from the 1848 revolution. Those familiar with the history of Prussia after the 1848 revolution will already know of the deep and lasting split that developed among two similar factions of conservatives. To use the terminology, problematic as all terminology is, employed by many historians, the split was between, on the one hand, arch-conservatives, Hochkonservativen, and on the other hand, so-called liberal conservatives, usually called liberale Konservativen or Liberalkonservativen, or, on occasion, national conservatives or moderate conservatives. The division became formalized at the latest when the group's flagship newspapers began to focus their attacks on each other. These newspapers were the so-called liberal conservative Preußisches Wochenblatt and the arch-conservative Neue Preußische Zeitung, more popularly known, of course, as the Kreuzzeitung. What was at stake in their feud? The two camps took different positions on everything, from the revisions to Prussia's constitution, to the role of religion in the public sphere, to the best course of action for Prussia during the Crimean War. More broadly, each faction tried to influence King Frederick William IV and Prussia's policies in such matters, and each lay claim to the mantle of patriotism and conservatism. In a word, each lay claim to be the proper leader of the post-1848 project of squelching revolution everywhere and shaping the role of Prussia in Germany and in the world. I will argue that the factional split was driven primarily by a genuinely ideological cultural divide, whose importance is made all the more pertinent by the factions' remarkable similarities. They had extremely similar material interests and class backgrounds. They had fairly common religious views and experiences, and a very high regard of and affinity for the king. They also had a familiar set of bogeymen, including France, liberalism, and of course, the revolution. I'll contend that often subtle differences in their worldviews tell us a deeply modern story about two conservative souls struggling for mastery in one breast, as my colleague Dennis Showalter puts it. I will focus on selected revisions to Prussia's constitution and the attempt to take ownership of certain key terms in the rhetorical civil war between the factions and their newspapers. The scholar Dagmar Busiek rightly identifies the proximate cause of the factions' break to be the 1851 decision of the Prussian government to reactivate by administrative fiat Prussia's provincial parliaments, the Provinziallandtage, since precisely such a move was in fact a violation of legislation from 1850. Busiek calls Manteuffel's gambit a sign of, quote, the governing class's unscrupulousness with a valid law, end quote. And she agrees with Ernst Rudolf Huber's characterization of the whole scheme as, quote, a little coup d'etat, namely a violation of the valid constitutional system, end quote. What did contemporaries see at stake in the restoration of the provincial estates? In short, many contemporaries recognized that the government was to some extent re-feudalizing Prussia's political order, potentially jeopardizing every gain from the 1848 revolution. Just days after the government ordered the reactivation of the Provinzialstände, the Kreuzzeitung celebrated the political shift. It recalled the post-1848 moments when its political allies had been, quote, a small group without direct connection to the government, fulfilling its holy duty to defend Recht, as often against the liberal opposition as against a vacillating government, end quote. But, quote, since the ministry had broken with the revolution, it crowed, the party of our friends ceased to have the exclusive character of a party of the Recht quand même. It became, at the same time, through the force of circumstances, a ministerial party, end quote. For the Kreuzzeitung, Manteuffel's move then did not endanger the law, and therefore the individual's freedom. Rather, it reestablished the supposedly legitimate, that is, ständisch, order that the revolution had illegally disestablished, thereby recreating the proper ständisch order in which true freedom could unfold. But responding to Manteuffel's administrative lawlessness, parliamentary representative Moritz August von Bethmann-Hollweg published a short pamphlet denouncing the means the government had chosen. Bethmann-Hollweg wrote that he, in fact, agreed with the goal the government is pursuing, quote unquote, and even the intent to return to, quote, an ordered state constitution, especially a ständisch order, end quote. But he vehemently insisted on a more clearly legal path to achieve this goal. He asserted, here's a quote, lawfulness is not for me abstract, literal legality. Law is the precept of the highest authority in the state, which obligates not only the subject and his conscience, but also establishes, above all, the authority itself, for the authority itself, the duty of truthfulness and fidelity concerning its spoken word. Not just the open break with this fidelity, but even the possible doubt of the same undermines the reputation of the authority and shakes the faith of the people in the ethics of public life, end quote. Considering the context of his life, Bethmann-Hollweg's words must have shocked many contemporaries, for in breaking with the government and his politically conservative allies in the Kreuzzeitung, he broke with his own past and those most like him. Bethmann-Hollweg's cri de coeur, his defense of the powerful tradition of the rule of law in Prussia, soon attracted supporters who eventually founded the Wochenblatt Zeitung. I've already agreed with Busiek's emphasis on the attempt to reactivate the Provinziallandtage as the proximate cause of the split, and I would further grant Walter Schmidt's claim that the failure of the Union project, as he put it, is the deeper reason for the separation of the Wochenblatt party, quote unquote. But while I think Schmidt is correct that foreign policy was also a powerful motivator for both conservative factions, I would contend that the picture is more complex than might be revealed in an analysis along the lines of the Primat der Außenpolitik versus the Primat der Innenpolitik. For both conservative factions, culture and ideology undergirded considerations of foreign and domestic policy. At stake were central questions such as those we saw Bethmann-Hollweg raising. What is lawfulness? What is authority? What is freedom? As Bethmann-Hollweg's quotes above show, there was a deeply ethical and religious element to his views. The fact that he continued to work harmoniously in religious affairs with his political opponents at the Kreuzzeitung indicates the value they both placed on religion as a high, and perhaps higher, authority. A shared or similar religious worldview also helped to keep even the Wochenblatt regular Ludwig Emil Mathis connected to his implacably ideological foe at the Kreuzzeitung, Ernst Ludwig von Gerlach. So it would be more accurate then to say that the views of both factions were profoundly informed by their theological views and religious experiences, to the extent that it was ever fully possible to disentangle the two. In order to understand the cause then of the division among these factions, we must understand something of the ongoing project of constitutional reform in the 1840s and 50s in Prussia. In the early days of the Revolution of 1848, King Frederick William IV had seemed resigned to both a constitution and a less independent rule for Prussia, famously declaring, Preußen geht fortan in Deutschland auf. As the German national delegates in Frankfurt hammered out what became a Kleindeutsch constitution, Prussian parliamentarians in Berlin worked on a Prussian constitution. Frederick William IV recovered his nerve and dealt first with a Prussian case, octroying a constitution in 1848. While this constitution was based on the liberal ideas of Waldeck A more telling point was that the king had issued the Constitution as a gift that he had freely given, and which, in theory, he could freely withdraw at any moment. He also immediately charged the Prussian parliament to revise the Constitution and make it more suitable, having already moved soldiers back into Berlin and the Prussian representatives out to a less revolutionary city. In the spring of 1849, Frederick William IV dealt with the German national representatives, offered the crown of a united Germany minus Austria. He faithfully rejected the crown as a crown from the gutter, quote unquote, rather than a crown from God. This quote tells us much about the king's obsession with his Gottesgnadentum, his view that the legitimacy of his rule rested on God's personal, gracious choice of him as king, on divine rather than on popular sovereignty. The king's Gottesgnadentum fit poorly with the constitutional wishes of many liberals, and of course, the 1848ers that we're talking about at our conference today. But nor did it fit perfectly with many of the king's arch-conservative allies at the Kreuzzeitung. For example, Ernst Ludwig von Gerlach worried at least as much about revolution from above, which he referred to as absolutism or Bonapartism, as he did about revolution from below, which he referred to as Jacobinism. To be clear, all of the Kreuzzeitung contributors and those of the Wochenblatt were confirmed monarchists. But those at the Kreuzzeitung viewed monarchy itself as having divinely founded origins. But following the writings of theorists such as Karl Ludwig von Haller and the organicist legal theorist Carl Friedrich Savigny, they also viewed other institutions, such as the state and aristocracy, as established by God to mediate between the king and his people. Conveniently for them, many Kreuzzeitung regulars just happened to be aristocrats. Yet while there was a clear element of self-interest in their position, many regulars at both papers were also, as was the king, devoted members of the neo-pietist awakening, and their sincerely held religious views both undergirded their monarchism and gave them a higher vantage point from which to critique monarchy and the monarch's policies, even those on the Constitution. So it might be tempting, then, to describe the Wochenblatt as taking a realist and the Kreuzzeitung an idealist position. And indeed, there is much in the language of both publications to support such an interpretation. As Boehner established, the Wochenblatt's main contributor's desideratum was a Kleindeutscher Nationalstaat with a fundamentally monarchical form of government, coexisting with a constitutionally grounded form of parliament, much along the lines of the British system. To achieve these ends, the paper's writers tended to oppose, on the one hand, Austria, the German Confederation, and France, all of which had reasons to be against their goal of a Prussian-led Nationalstaat, and, on the other hand, the Revolution, a term that encompassed much for them, primarily signifying the Revolution of 1848, but also evoking images of the French Revolution of 1789, and much else. But in their nearly religious faith in the good of the nation, and in its need for a single state to represent it, or more accurately, most of it, that is, the non-Austrian majority, there was a de facto idealistic trait, the preference for ideology, of the ideology of nationalism. The Wochenblatt's central area of concern, namely how to answer to the German question, would later be complicated by an answer to the Eastern question, pointing to an interpenetration of foreign and domestic concerns. The Kreuzzeitung's writers also recognized the interpenetration of domestic and foreign issues, but in general, domestic concerns trumped foreign concerns. Towards the beginning of the Crimean War, their answer to the Eastern question was, in effect, to push for a restoration of the Holy Alliance. This de facto pro-Russian answer to the Eastern question was related to their answer to the German question, which was, in general, to defer to Austria's traditional position of leadership among the German states, while at the same time safeguarding Prussia's interests. Above all, they wished to avoid the evils of revolution from below, as 1848 had seemed to them, or revolution from above. And yet the still more important concerns that animated them were otherworldly. Driven by their awakened faith, the Kreuzzeitung contributors genuinely believed in the holiness of an alliance among Christian monarchs, in the threateningly secular nature of revolution, and in the divine sanction given not only to the princes of the German states, but also to traditional intermediary bodies, such as the aristocracy. Indeed, both the Wochenblatt and the Kreuzzeitung laid claim to the mantle of conservatism. Both were substantially inspired by religious views, and both were animated by concerns of principles. So then what were these principles? The Wochenblatt enthusiasts wanted a strong Prussian monarchy anchored in a strong constitutional order with a representative parliament and a Kleindeutsch national state. In its inaugural issue, Ludwig Emil Matthes laid out these guiding principles. He argued this, quote, "We hold that the Constitution, honestly applied, offers the very measure of freedom by which a strong monarchy, which Prussia needs, can endure. We will combat every attempt to widen the measure of freedom through weakening of the monarchy, every attempt to reduce it. We also hold, however, in view of the shining examples of England, that healthy conservative principles and principles of freedom do not exclude one another, and that it would be not reduction, but rather a strengthening of freedom, a new and powerful guarantee for the preservation of our Constitution, if one could succeed in the ordering of our communal order, unseres Gemeindewesens, in particular in the Eastern Province, in the country, and in provincial representation, as well as for the electoral law in all connections, to find an organic basis in place of a mechanical one." We note here that long before Gramsci wrote about cultural hegemony, the Wochenblatt's authors realized that those who control the definitions and connotations of key terms have all but won the hearts and minds of their audience. Here, they lay claim to the ownership of organic law. Like other Wochenblatt authors, Matthes also wished to avoid ceding the religious high ground to the Kreuzzeitung in this cultural battle with political and legal ramifications. He further wrote, quote, "We set the fear of God at the apex. We do not desire to carry the cross into daily politics, though. Nothing of the sort. But we do not wish to desecrate holy truths and distorting them ourselves in the din of the political marketplace. Neither do we wish to claim the fear of God as an exclusive monopoly of our party, and therefore deny it to others, because they think differently in politics than we do." Tragically for the Wochenblatt, this move amounted to unilateral disarmament, given that the Kreuzzeitung made no such concession, and that the awakened king regarded himself truly as king by God's grace, and that it was commonplace for liberals as well as conservatives to see politics and religion as mutually interpenetrating spheres. The Wochenblatt had also addressed in its inaugural issue what it called the solidarity of conservative interests as the guiding principle of Prussia's foreign policy. The crux of their argument was a realist one. It asserted that, quote, "the foreign policy of our government can only reasonably serve the purpose of preserving, increasing, and protecting the power, the reputation, and the influence of the state. This is reachable only by a legal path." Such positions were body blows to the Kreuzzeitung, whose writers had labored to create a viable conservative alternative to revolution from above and below. Kreuzzeitung regular Friedrich Julius Stahl had carefully defined the term revolution in 1852. He declared, revolution, quote, "Revolution is the establishment of the entire public condition on the will of man rather than on God's order and providence. That all governing authority and power is not from God, but rather from human beings, from the people, and that the entire social condition has as its goal not the application of God's holy commandments and the fulfillment of His world plan, but solely the satisfaction and willful behavior of human beings." End quote. For Stahl then, quote, "The revolution is therefore the utmost sin in the political sphere," end quote, since it entailed what he called, quote, "the fundamental abolition of God's order." How then could you defeat the revolution? The Wochenblatt had argued that combating the revolution required different weapons. Quote, "The means to heal our epoch's peculiar revolutionary ideas, which are partly after pains of the revolution, partly symptoms of threatening newer convulsions, belong to domestic politics. They aim to withdraw the revolution's nourishment and consist mainly in good, just, and honest government, in solidifying authority, which is also shaken by weak bearing abroad, in healthy state institutions, a wise educational system, elevating and spreading a true fear of God." Such an explanation was mainly realist in its emphasis on sound governance structures. But while the Wochenblatt also mentions the positive spreading of a sound of the fear of God, religion was for Stahl the main answer to the threat posed by the revolution. He asserted, quote, "There is a power, but only one power, that shuts down revolution. This is Christianity. Christianity is the most extreme opposite of the sins of the revolution, for it bases all of human life on God's order and providence, but Christianity is simultaneously the most profound satisfaction of the impulses to revolution." Could the commercial spoils of subscriptions and advertisements have accounted for the acrimony between these two papers? Probably not, as the Wochenblatt never rivaled the Kreuzzeitung's publication numbers. The potential political spoils were far higher. While readers of neither paper were overwhelming in number, the audience included some powerful figures, including Prussia's king. The notoriety of the authors involved in each paper, including sitting politicians and lay leaders of the state church, also added heft to the arguments. And the Wochenblatt's authors included notable diplomatic figures as well. The scholar Huber went so far as to claim that the leaders of the Wochenblatt party had, quote, the character of a shadow cabinet. And indeed, the influence of the National Liberal Wochenblatt would be felt keenly at the start of the new era. But the highest stakes here were cultural, rhetorical, and ideological. As we've seen for both the Wochenblatt and Kreuzzeitung, ownership of key terminology, such as what constituted revolution, was central and prior to devising good policies to combat the revolution. Given the similarities of their backgrounds and views, then, and the utter dissimilarity of their concepts of freedom and the law, it's little wonder that these two pro-monarchical and anti-revolutionary twins, like Jacob and Esau, could never agree to share the birthright of conservative ideology. Thank you.
His book about the revolution in Kiel, and very lately, just a few days ago, he finished a book about Kiel during the First World War. So we have Martin, and even supported by a PowerPoint presentation. Wunderbar, thank you, Martin.
Okay, thank you. Why did the Schleswig-Holstein question lead to the failure of the German National Parliament in 1848? I'd actually need this PowerPoint because within my presentation I want to show you some contemporary caricatures that will tell you the story of the failed revolution. And as you will know, 1848 is a period for the first time you got freedom of press, and caricaturists were allowed to show what they thought about the course of the revolution and to play pun on the politicians. So, that makes it a bit difficult, but we'll start anyway. Okay. That's the disadvantages of modern techniques.
Martin, you're the specialist, the IT
Okay.
man.
Okay. In the night from the 23rd to the 24th of March 1848, politicians from the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein proclaimed in Kiel a provisional government and split with the King of Denmark as their ruler. At the same time, the new government declared that both duchies will join Germany and will become part of the new German nation state. The breakaway of Schleswig and Holstein from the Danish state was the starting signal to a 3-year war of the two duchies with Denmark. Why did the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein break away from Denmark in spring of 1848, and which impact did it have on the course of the German Revolution in 1848? In the spring of 1848, Germany was no nation state, but as you can see on this map, a loose confederation of 35 independent states and 4 independent cities that were ruled by more or less authoritarian kings and dukes who did not really take care about Germany, but most of all acted according to their own political interests and advantages. And you can see on this map the state, this is the Duchy of Schleswig and the one of Holstein. They were together, but Holstein, the southern one, as you can see, is part of the German Confederation, and then there is the border to the Duchy of Schleswig, which was no part of the German Confederation. That's the problem I will talk about. In most of these individual German states, particularly in the biggest German state, the Kingdom of Prussia, the people had been denied basic civil liberties for decades. There were neither democratically elected parliaments nor liberal constitutions that granted basic civil liberties to the people. Freedom of speech, freedom of the press did not exist. On the contrary, the newspapers were censored, progressive political parties were prohibited, and the liberal opposition was suppressed and driven into exile. However, this dire political climate was suddenly to change when the German Revolution started in Berlin on the 18th of March, 1848, as you can see on this picture. The revolutionaries in the streets of Berlin and in many other cities demanded a united German nation state based on a liberal constitution, plus liberal reforms and general elections to a national assembly. The people living in Schleswig and Holstein did not want to miss that window of opportunity and wanted to become a part of that revolutionary and democratic movement that was to shape a new liberal German nation state. But their decision to break away with the Danish king and to join Germany also marked the beginning of the military conflict with Denmark. In this conflict, the German Federation supported the German-speaking people in the two duchies. However, the northern part of the Duchy of Schleswig was populated by Danish-speaking people who did not want to become German citizens and who considered themselves to be Danish. Unfortunately, neither the provisional government in Kiel nor the Danish king in Copenhagen was willing to divide the Duchy of Schleswig according to the national identity of the people. In 1848, the war began, and the troops of the newly founded Schleswig-Holstein army, supported mainly by troops from Prussia, quickly moved deep into Jutland and Danish territory. In the summer of 1848, it looked as if the German side was to win the war. While the soldiers from Schleswig-Holstein and other German states moved deep into Denmark, the German National Parliament was constituted on the 18th of May 1848 in the St. Paul's Church at Frankfurt. In the following weeks, the German National Parliament passed several resolutions that the duchies of Schleswig and Holstein were integral parts of a new German state. Moreover, the Parliament repeatedly declared that it was to support the duchies in their struggle against Denmark. However, the German National Parliament faced one big problem. The German troops fighting alongside the Schleswig-Holstein army against Denmark were not commanded by the Parliament in Frankfurt or the central government it backed, but by the rulers and generals of the individual states the troops came from. The further the German troops, particularly those from Prussia, moved into Jutland, the more Russia and Great Britain increased their pressure on the Prussian king to withdraw his troops from Jutland back south of the border of the Duchy of Schleswig. Russia and Britain, Britain represented by its Foreign Secretary Lord Palmerston, feared that in case Prussia would defeat Denmark, that it was to take control of the entrance to the Baltic Sea. In that case, the British fleet would no longer be able to move into the Baltic Sea, and the Russian fleet would be stuck to the Baltic Sea. So both powers had a vital interest in preventing Prussia from crushing Denmark, and therefore increased their pressure on the Prussian king. On the 20th of May, 1848, the Prussian king, Frederick William IV, bowed to the international pressure and began to withdraw his troops into positions south of the border of Jutland, while at the same time the Schleswig-Holstein army continued its fight against Denmark. At the same time, international pressure on Prussia increased. Swedish diplomats initiated secret peace talks between Denmark and Prussia in the southern Swedish city of Malmö. On the 26th of August 1848, the Danish and Prussian diplomats signed an armistice treaty lasting for 7 months and ending the war between both countries. Neither the provisional government in Kiel nor the National German Parliament in Frankfurt had been involved in these peace negotiations. And both of them were utterly surprised about the conditions of the armistice because in nearly every point, Prussia had bowed to Danish demands. In this contemporary caricature, you can see the Prussian king Frederick William IV crawling the beard of his Danish counterpart, Frederick VII, asking him, are you being pleased with the conditions of the treaty? That's the Treaty of the 26th. And this caricature thus shows the big disappointment of the German public that Prussia had given into any Danish demands concerning the future of Schleswig-Holstein. In this treaty, Prussia did no longer insist on the duchies being a part of the German nation-state. Instead, the duchies should be demilitarized and for the next 7 months be put under a joint government of politicians from Denmark, supervised by politicians from Prussia and Sweden. When the news of the armistice and the conditions attached to it were published in the German newspapers in early September 1848, the public was infuriated. In Kiel, massive protests against Prussia's solo effort broke out, and Prussian officers were driven and kicked out of the city forcefully. In Frankfurt, the German National Parliament immediately summoned all its members for the 5th of September to debate the armistice. On the 5th of September, the German National Parliament came together. Friedrich Christoph Dahlmann, you can see him here, the leading conservative member of the parliament from Schleswig-Holstein and professor of history and constitutional law at the University of Bonn, gave an impressive speech asking his fellow members whether they could justify it to their conscience to agree to the armistice conditions and let the people of Schleswig-Holstein alone in their struggle for independence from Denmark. He then reminded his fellow MPs of the numerous declarations they had unanimously passed in support of the duchies in recent weeks and asked them to reject the treaty. He finally explained to the parliamentarians that the German people will no longer trust their parliament in case he should not defend the duchies against Denmark, after they had been left alone by Prussia. This was undoubtedly Dahlmann's most important speech in his life. After a fierce debate, the parliamentarians rejected the armistice treaty by 238 votes against 221. As you can see, a very narrow decision. Although Dahlmann was a conservative, in his ballot he was supported mainly by left-wing parliamentarians and thus paved the way for the rejection of the armistice treaty by the German National Assembly. In this caricature, which is entitled Solemn Burial of a 7-month Child, we see Dahlmann as the third person from the right in a funeral procession behind a children's coffin. That's Dahlmann here, that's Robert Blum, the children's coffin. On the coffin, the words are written, Waffenstillstand, that is armistice, and the first person in the procession tells us that the child was born on the 26th of August at Malmö, which is of course the day, and the place the armistice between Prussia and Denmark had been signed, and that the child was buried at Frankfurt on the 5th of September 1848, the day the armistice was rejected by the German National Assembly. Dahlmann is accompanied mainly by left-wing politicians, and the child's coffin is carried by Robert Blum, the leader of the political left in the German parliament. We will see him in some more caricatures. Immediately after the ballot in parliament, the conservative German prime minister, Fürst von Leiningen, who had voted in favor of the treaty, and his government resigned. In this caricature, we can see Leiningen and his ministers at the back of the procession with those ravens on top. That's the government that has resigned after the treaty has been rejected by the German National Assembly. Dahlmann had caused the government to resign, and he was now asked to form a new government because it seemed that he was supported by a majority of parliamentarians. For 4 days, Dahlmann talked to the leaders of the different parliamentary parties and factions, but to no avail. In this contemporary caricature, we can see him as an organ grinder, playing the Schleswig-Holstein lied, the unofficial anthem of the duchies, national anthem of the duchies, and begging with his cap in his hand the MPs for political support. Around his feet, there are a number of left-wing parliamentarians. Once again, we can see here Robert Blum with his beard, the same guy. He's there with his fellow left-wing parliamentarians dancing around Dahlmann's feet. However, the left-wing and the progressive MPs were unwilling to support the conservative Dahlmann. And after 4 days, on the 9th of September 1848, Dahlmann gave up and returned the task to form a new government to the provisional head of state, the liberal Archduke Johann of Austria. Darrel had been able to bring together a majority in the German National Assembly against the armistice of Malmö, but he was unable to find a majority that was willing to support him as a conservative prime minister. Now Germany was in a deep political crisis, as it had no government and national parliament was blocking the creation of a new one. Moreover, to make things even worse, on the 9th of September, the same day Darrel gave up, the Parliament of Schleswig-Holstein in Kiel had unanimously passed a liberal constitution for the state of Schleswig-Holstein that declared the duchies an independent state and a part of Germany. They so wanted to save or rescue the democratic achievements of the March Revolution in Kiel, because they feared they will be betrayed by Prussia and all these achievements will be lost. Thus, the government and the parliament in Kiel took a decision that was directly opposite to the decision of the Prussian government. From now on, the governments in Kiel and Berlin were no longer allies in their struggle against Denmark, but had become political opponents in regard to the political and national future of Schleswig-Holstein. At the same time, Prussia increased the pressure on the German National Parliament in Frankfurt to accept the military and political reality and to agree to the Armistice Treaty in a second vote. So on the 16th of September 1848, the German National Parliament met again, and this time voted by 258 votes against 237 votes, again a very narrow decision, in favor of the armistice. Immediately after accepting the armistice in this second vote, the old government was reinstalled to power. In this contemporary caricature from September 1848, titled The Resurrection of September the 16th, we can see in the middle Heinrich von Gagan, the president of the German National Assembly, orchestrating the resurrection of the ministers of the old government from their graves. These are the old ministers that have resigned on the 5th, but are now reinstalled into power. The cross in the foreground, it's here, bears the inscription, died on the 5th of September, the day the parliament had initially rejected the treaty. Once it became known that the German National Assembly had caved in to the pressure from Prussia and passed the armistice, riots broke out all over Germany. The worst rioting took place in Frankfurt, the seat of the German National Parliament. The people, particularly the Republicans, the progressive left, and the workers, felt betrayed by their parliament and tried to storm the St. Paul's Church, as you can see on this illustration. The members of parliament, especially those who had voted in favor of the armistice, had to flee from the building to save their lives. Many of them asked Prussia and Austria to send troops from nearby towns to Frankfurt in order to protect the parliament. On the 18th of September, two leading conservative MPs, Prince Lichnowsky and General von Auerswald, who had voted in favor of the armistice, were lynched by an angry mob in the streets of Frankfurt. After 2 days of severe fighting in the streets of Frankfurt, Prussian and Austrian troops using artillery finally crushed the protest, as you can see on this illustration. Now, the German National Parliament was at the mercy of the troops of the King of Prussia. The second ballot on the armistice and the future of Schleswig-Holstein had driven a wedge between the parliament and the people it was to represent. In the eyes of the angry public, the parliament had lost its credibility after changing its mind and voting in favor of the armistice. But the parliament itself was also deeply divided. Whereas the conservatives cautiously wanted to continue reforming the German Confederation in accordance with the ruling monarchs, the political left realized that most of these monarchs were not interested at all in any liberal reforms. The political left feared that the national parliament was nothing but a toothless tiger, unable to push through real reforms against the will of the ruling monarchs. Therefore, the political left decided to take the struggle back to the streets, where it had started in March 1848. In October 1848, an armed uprising broke out in Vienna, and the people declared Austria to be a republic. One of their leaders was Robert Blum, which you've seen before, the leader of the political left in the German National Parliament. This uprising cost more than 2,000 lives and was brutally crushed by Field Marshal Windischgrätz and his troops on behalf of the Austrian Emperor. Robert Blum fell into the hands of these reactionary troops and, despite of his political immunity as a member of parliament, was executed on the 9th of November 1848 near Vienna, becoming thus the probably most famous martyr of the failed revolution. This is the execution of Robert Blum on the 9th of November, the leader of the parliamentary left in the German National Assembly. After the second ballot on the armistice and Schleswig-Holstein, the reactionary forces in Prussia also gained the upper hand. The Prussian king and his government quickly realized that the national parliament in Frankfurt had no real power because it didn't have any troops loyal to the parliament and the central government. In October, we've heard it from the speaker before me, the Prussian king began to withdraw the liberal concessions he had made in the beginning of the revolution in March of 1848. In November of 1848, he ordered General Wrangel and his troops to return from Holstein to Berlin, the city his soldiers had to withdraw from after severe fighting in the streets in March. Once Wrangel and his 40,000 soldiers had retaken control of Berlin, the king declared the state of siege, lifted any liberal concessions and reforms, and his soldiers began to disarm the citizens and the citizens' militias. In early November 1848, the king drove the democratically elected Prussian parliament out of the capital and, at the end of that month, dissolved it by force. Additionally, the revolutionaries had split in two parties. At the beginning of the revolution in March, workers, citizens, and students had fought side by side for political reforms. After the violent clashes in Frankfurt, following the second ballot on the future of Schleswig-Holstein, the citizens became increasingly afraid of the radical workers and that wanted to push their revolution ahead, if necessary, by force. In October, violent clashes erupted in Berlin between moderates on the one side and radical Democrats and workers on the other. In the streets of Berlin-Spandau, citizens shot at radical workers who wanted to save the revolution and the democratic achievements. Dozens of people were killed. In November 1848, the revolutionaries in Prussia had lost the cause, and the king was back in charge. From now on, the German Revolution was doomed to fail, as the revolutionaries were split and the national parliament had proven to be unable to steer the revolution in a clear direction. In Prussia, the counter-revolution was in full swing. To summarize, the two ballots on the national affiliation of Schleswig-Holstein in September of 1848 showed that the German National Parliament, as the only democratically legitimized representation of the German people, was unable to push through the demands of the German people for liberal reforms against the reactionary German monarchs and their generals. The defeat of the National Parliament against the King of Prussia with regard to the Schleswig-Holstein question split the National Assembly and the revolutionaries as well, and was a starting signal for the counter-revolution headed by the King of Prussia. Although the parliament continued to meet until the April of 1849, it had proven to be a toothless tiger that was doomed to fail. In the summer of 1849, Prussia finally withdrew its political support for the Duchies of Schleswig and Holstein, and the London Protocol of 1850 agreed to restore them to Denmark. In January 1851, Prussian and Austrian generals deposed the two independent governors of Schleswig-Holstein, who had already been members of the revolutionary provisional government founded in March of 1848, and forced them into exile. In February 1851, Prussian and Austrian troops moved into the Duchy of Holstein in order to subdue it and return it 1 year later to the Danish king. Until the Second War of Schleswig-Holstein in 1864, the duchies remained a part of Denmark. After 1851, many of the brightest, progressive politicians and intellectuals left Schleswig-Holstein and Germany, immigrated to the United States of America, particularly to this area, and transplanted their values into American society. And that's why we're here today. And with the portraits of these three major emigrants from Schleswig-Holstein, I would like to finish my paper. Thank you.
In 1982, I started intensive research in medicine, Schleswig-Holstein Society. We have the best collection of German-speaking newspapers, and in a way, every single issue, weekly newspapers, 1860, talked about the Schleswig-Holstein question. So it was a long, long period. The Schleswig-Holstein question just explained by Martin to us, was world politics. Like we read for many years about Israel and the neighbors' conflicts or Northern Ireland. When you read over years and years the same topic, that was the Schleswig-Holstein. Would you agree, Martin?
Yeah.
Well, here we have now the experts, and I see the rover with a question mark in his eyes. Billy Boy from Devonport, president of the Society for German American Studies. What might be your first question to these colleagues?
Excellent request. I think my first question would be going back to 1848 and that idea of Schleswig-Holstein as an independent republic. Was that actually feasible? And I'm thinking of Belgium, said the generations before. Was there a realistic expectation it might happen in 1848? A new independent little country in Northern Europe.
No.
I'm
sorry, this is a problem. I don't think that there was a realistic chance because this new republic would have had a serious problem of having in the Northern Duchy two totally different kind of people in a way. One wanted to belong to Denmark, one wanted to belong to German or an independent republic being part of another German state. And as long as you don't split in a way the Duchy of Schleswig, you would have had this in a way national conflict. They were speaking different languages, they wanted to belong to different states. This would have probably in a way destroyed that republic or made it not workable. And the other thing was, as we know from Bismarck later, in Prussia there was no interest for any, in a way, republic that had liberal ideas. The constitution passed on the 9th of September 1848 in Kiel for Schleswig-Holstein was the most liberal constitution in Germany passed, and heavily influenced later the Pulse-Statement constitution. And Prussia would not have accepted a constitution where every man above 21 was allowed to vote, irrespective of his income, whether rich or poor, one man, one vote. And this was totally unthinkable for Prussia, and they would have not accepted any state being built on such an election system.
Primarily because of objection to Prussians, I would agree that this wasn't really a viable possibility, but I don't think it's a sort of a slam dunk answer to say no, because we have, of course, the example of Belgium as a state which had two very different populations, which could have gone to other states that surrounded it. And so I think it's an initial possibility that might have occurred, but ultimately the power of Prussia probably would have prevented it. I agree.
Excellent question. Thank you, Bill. Steve Rowan.
Just a very quick comment. I'm always reminded of Lord Palmerston, who supposedly was cast in the British Parliament, he would have been in the House of Lords, what his opinion was or feeling was about Schleswig-Holstein, and he said there are only three people who ever understood the Schleswig-Holstein problem. The first was a German professor who was mad. The second was the king of Denmark who was dead, and himself, and he said he had forgotten most of it.
Are you concerned about the state of mind here?
No, I would just say that by the time you got to the end of it, of course, with Palmerston, it was a tiresome old issue that everyone else wished would just go away.
Would you agree, Martin?
Yes. From 1848 till 1864, this was the big European question to be solved. And in 1864, that was the problem. Denmark, when Denmark changed its constitution, I have to say 1850 was agreed, Schleswig and Holstein must be treated in the exactly same way. Denmark cannot treat one duchy in a different way than the other one. And in 1863, the Danish Parliament decided to split Schleswig from Holstein and treat it in a constitutionally different way than Holstein, and then thought we will be helped by the British and other powers if this should cause problems with Prussia or Germany. But then Amherst and the others said, no, we didn't stick to the agreements of 1850, we're not going to help them out. And Bismarck then took that opportunity to crush Denmark and, in a way, conquer also both duchies and make them a province of Prussia, not the independent state that Schleswig-Holstein wanted to achieve. That was a big question until Bismarck said, let's do it, take the chance, the opportunity to conquer.
We have this wonderful situation. Here we have these Schleswig-Holstein experts, and now we have our Danish friend Jan Jessen. But just before Jan will get up and have his statement and question, early when we had our refreshments, there was a colleague from the United State University in Minnesota, and he said his colleague from Aalborg, Denmark, teaching together with him, told him, well, these days there is a group in Denmark, they would like to move the border which we have in between Denmark and Germany, Denmark and Schleswig-Holstein, somewhere to a river, which is the Ida River. So this is a little group, but maybe Jan can comment on that as well. At least the Nona State University is teaching new borders for Germany. Thank you, Jan.
I'll just say one comment, Yogi. May I just add one comment? A few weeks ago, the Schleswig-Holstein Constitutional Court had to decide whether Danish politicians, the seats of 3 Danish politicians in the Parliament of Schleswig-Holstein were lawful or illegal. The Danish minorities currently in the government, the left-wing government backs this government. Conservative forces question the legality of these Danish MPs in order to bring down this government. So the question is, up to our days, heavily debated, what is the status of the minorities and where does it belong to? So it's still 150 years later in everyday politics an important issue.
So the Schleswig-Holstein question we just learned about world politics is kind of still going on. But yeah, we are really looking forward to have you now as an expert from the Danish point of view.
Well, actually, it's no question. It's just like I just like to ask.
Maybe you get up and speak as loud as possible, or you go to the microphone. Okay. He's a Viking. Hardcore day.
There's actually no questions. Just like to add a little supplement to the question which you had. What was I trying to say? Yeah, you were asking whether it was a realistic situation if Schleswig-Holstein could turn into a republic in 1848. And there is one other reason why it wasn't realistic, because Denmark would never allow that. And it was one of the core issues leading to this conflict, that Denmark was very, very anxious to keep, especially Schleswig, within the Danish colony. So it was a very, very important thing which spoke against it. Yeah. And what was it you were trying to tell
Changing borders.
Changing borders.
You like to change the border too?
No. No, we have to respect, what the things which were decided upon in 1920. It was a democratic process, and there are sometimes, it's more groups, mostly for fun. It's not always that serious. Serious. People talking about moving the border back to the Ida River, but I don't think that should take up too much despite things.
Gerald and I, we live in Flensburg, my hometown. This is the border town of Denmark, and we grew up, all of us, like Klaus and I, at the same high school, with a substantial Danish minority. These are Danes with a German passport. We have a Danish daily newspaper. We have a Danish high school in Flensburg. And north of the border, we have a German minority in Denmark. These are Germans with a Danish passport, with a German daily newspaper and a German high school. And Jan has a little...
Yeah, there's just one more comment. And also, the whole debate on borders is very anachronistic, especially in these times where you... Even louder, I feel like I'm shouting at you.
No, I take the microphone. Yeah.
Okay, so the whole discussion about borders is also very anachronistic in these times,
because the border between Denmark and Germany at these days is almost invisible. You just drive across it every day and don't feel it or see it. So talking about moving the border, it's, well, I'm very personal now, it's like a bad joke. So, well, it was the next question.
Great, thank you, Jan. And the interesting aspect is Klaus and I, actually when we were writing this essay on my birthday, we went into the Central Danish Library in Kleinfeld, which is the largest library of the Danish minority in northern Germany. And Jan is running a special collection. There was a guy, a politician from the Danish minority in Berlin, I think, who had collected wonderful historical books, and they were nearly forgotten, this collection of his history books. And Jan has this dream job of running that collection, and that's why he's here, and why we started a friendship. Klaus and I ran into him, and I thought I saw a photo of his family, and I thought it was Angelina, the famous Hollywood star, but so that is another aspect of our friendship. Yeah,
a question. Actually, it's more of an observation. But first of all, thank you, because actually, I don't think we could have planned it any better how much your papers speak to each other, because there's a common language throughout. There's languages about freedom in all of your papers, whether it's spatially or in terms of an idea, whether it has to do with republicanism or conservatism. There's always also this issue of legality. How does one affect change or prevent change? Does the parliament have, in its votes, even have any power? There's also with all of yours a notion of lawfulness. Do we maintain a lawful order or not? Or does it devolve into unlawfulness? So actually what I would be curious is, my question would be, I'd be love you, and I don't know if we have enough time for this, but actually maybe make a few comments on how you think your ideas, the concept that you talked about, relate to or play off of the other speakers. And I'll give you 30 seconds. But I think that's a very, I think it could be a very interesting dialogue. And we don't have enough time to do all of it here, but I just, top of your head, what thoughts?
There are a lot of great connections, I think, that we could draw between the papers, and that you've done a good job of starting us in that direction. What you say echoes something that I was thinking about, and that's that everybody so far, including Yogi, has referred to the failed revolution of 1848. But it's an open question in the scholarly literature whether it failed, or whether it was at least partially a success, right? And especially so to make a link to Daniel Nadel's paper, if we view the revolution in a transatlantic sense, I think we can say, well, arguably it succeeds through its failure, or at least partial failure in the German-speaking land. What happens for the United States is ultimately through the crucible of the Civil War, a strengthening of the Republic and an end to slavery, all of which, of course, are good things. We could argue that these ideals held by the 1848ers, among many others, succeed very powerfully in the United States. If we go to the German-speaking lands, you could argue, at least in terms of structural transformation, there's a half loaf. There are some successes, right? There are written constitutions, even in Prussia. Even though, of course, the king, Frederick IV, eternally looked for a way to get out of the oath that he had sworn to the Constitution, he felt bound by it. There are other structural gains as well. So the fact that even the concepts of freedom and constitution and law become the terms of the debate, no matter how contested they are, you could argue is at least a partial success of the revolution. I think in terms of national unity, especially the unification of all the states, it gets much more problematic, and there might be a really interesting link to Europe.
If I can add one point to what you said. It failed in 1848, but if you look at the Constitution of the Weimar Republic in 1919, many of the paragraphs on the civil liberties of the people were actually literally taken from the 1848 Constitution. So the people who wrote the St. Paul's Church Constitution did a marvelous job, and the people after the Revolution of 1918 just had to pick up the work they'd done. And the new Constitution, in many parts on basic rights, was taken directly from the 1848 Constitution. And the paragraphs on the liberal civil liberties are still from 1849 to 1919 to our Grundgesetz from 1949. So there is a line of more than 100 years of German constitutionalism and basic rights that began in 1848. So we cannot say that it completely failed. It had less an impact on the way of German shape and people live together.
Thank you, thank you.
And let me just
Yeah, sorry.
add to that very briefly.
Speak loud.
Yeah. First of all, the people that made these uprisings in Frankfurt and later also the so-called Struve Putsch by a guy named Gustav Struve, who later also immigrates to the United States and becomes one of the 48ers. I mean, these are the people that later became the 48ers in the United States. I mean, so the people that fight against the Malmö Amstis are just are the people that I'm talking about, basically. They are disillusioned with German national politics, and they especially think that there is no agreement to be had with the monarchs. And I want to echo that I think the constitutionalization of Prussia is very important, that Prussia at the end of the revolution has a constitution and keeps it, undermines it during much of the 1850s, but it reemerges in the new era as a really important tool and as an important way of having an opposition within Prussia, something that has not existed, for instance, in Austria at that time. So I totally agree with that. Another thing that I want to ask, which was very important back then and has been totally forgotten, is the that feudalism was abolished. I mean, many people still pay taxes to landlords, and all these ancient traditions of feudalism were just abolished in 1848, sometimes very comprehensively, for instance, in Austria. And Austria, of course, doesn't only mean Austria, but as we've seen on the map, it means basically Southeast Europe.
Thank you, thank you. We have Jan and Carl.
Just a kind of
Speak loud, Carl.
Just a short fact check. Blue execution was, and I'm going back to Martin's latest comment, the blue execution was on November 9th. And the Kiel rejected Constitution was also on November 9th.
No.
They had all the Weimar Republic called out November 9th. From German historian perspective, just all coincidence or?
The rejection of the constitution was on the 5th of September, and then it was adopted in the second vote in 16th September. You are right, the execution of Robert Blum was the 9th of November 1848 near Vienna. So that is one of those 9th of November. The other ones, you will surely know them, is of course the armistice of the First World War. Not the armistice, but the end of the surrender of the end of the First World War. Then the failed Hitler putsch on that day in 1923 in Munich. Then the night again orchestrated. Kristallnacht. It's called Kristallnacht, or the pogrom orchestrated by the Nazis against the Jews in 1938. And of course, the day the wall came down by peaceful demonstrations on the 9th of November 1989 in Eastern Germany. So these four 9th of November, there's also the execution of Robert Blum. I mean, he's been the leader of the left parties, as we, if we might call them parties, of the left-wing politicians in the German National Assembly. He was simply taken by the soldiers and executed, irrespective of his political immunity.
By orders from above.
Yeah.
They said, we will execute him and let where we go, and because we want to make sure that you understand our message.
Yeah, there is a wonderful caricature, I can only explain it in a way to you. There is the president of the German National Assembly snoring at his speaker's place. All the other members of the assembly are having caps on, snoring in parliament, and in the background you see Robert Blum being executed, and above the speaker is a big sign: no member of parliament can be arrested, executed, because he has political immunity. They were all sleeping, and the leader is executed. So that shows once again the parliament could take a lot of decisions, The politicians and the military didn't care about these decisions. They started the counter-revolution, and Robert Blum was the first famous victim.
My question goes back to this is all a coincidence. So succession dates playing off this would be a historic perspective. Are they coincidences? November?
Yes. And most of them are coincidences. Of course, the 1923 and 1938, they belong together because they were orchestrated by Hitler and then by the Nazi Party. But the rest is pure coincidence.
Thank you, thank you. Later, these three gentlemen are very close to the hearts of Edith Robbins because Friedrich Hedde had founded later Grand Island, her American hometown, and Scott and I on a daily basis think about these gentlemen. So we would love to have these three scholars, these three famous 48ers, and all of you behind the three men for a group photo later before we have lunch. Would that be all right? Jan, you had risen your beautiful hand.
Oh, just a comment to your question.
Get up and then...
Yeah, okay. Just the last comment on your question, whether the 48 revolution was a success or not. I think it was
about the different languages and how we're speaking about it.
Yeah, in any way it was. Even Denmark, which was the main opponent in this situation, was turned into a constitutional monarchy. Even though it remained a monarchy, it was turned into a constitutional monarchy, which actually in daily practice meant that the king lost all power. Only once did the king, after 1912, try to raise his voice, which almost got him beheaded. And no king or queen of Denmark ever said a word in public. So you could see that as an expression of it happened. So even the Danes learned the lesson. Yeah. Thank you.
May I add one thing to it? When the constitution in Kiel was passed, within 1 week it was translated into Danish. And again, the catalogue on the civil liberties is the same in the Denmark Constitution of 1849 than the Schleswig-Holstein Constitution of 1848. Both countries or duchies have been in war with each other, but they built a constitution that is nearly a literal translation. So they had, at one certain point, they shared common values again about the rights of human beings. So there are many, many strange things fighting against each other, but at the same time, defining the same ideas about human rights.
Well, a great example, I think, how much these 48ers often have been ahead of their times. Theodor Olshausen and Hans Reimer Clausen, both from Schleswig-Holstein, they studied law in Kiel, became very, very close friends, and were very close friends when both were living in Davenport, Iowa. The revolution had started in Berlin, March 18th, 19th. These two men, with three others, went to Copenhagen. They had close friends, the 1848ers, so to speak, the Democrats, the Republicans in Copenhagen, had been long, long time close friends. Hans Reimer Clausen had married a Danish lady, emigrated with his mother-in-law from Denmark, Copenhagen. So these guys had no nationalism in their heart. And they realized there will be an upcoming war in between Schleswig-Holstein, the civil war, uproar, however you look at it, from Schleswig-Holstein against Denmark. And they wanted to avoid that war and wanted to talk with the Danish king and tell him a solution. Let's have a plebiscite, an election by parishes along the line from Flensburg, Baltic Sea, to Trondheim, to the North Sea part of the Atlantic. They failed because the Danish king was not free anymore. The national movement in Copenhagen by the casino party and so on was so strong, and maybe Jan will give some details, that they could not really meet the Danish king and talk with him and find a peaceful solution. So the war came. The war had no solution. 1864, the next war, Prussia and Austria against Denmark. And 1920, Woodrow Wilson, your president,
philosophy professor from Princeton, as part of the armistice of the First World War, he had made the concept or the decision that in these areas where you have a German minority in southern Denmark, a Danish minority in northern Germany, the people should decide if they want to be part of Denmark or Germany. In Flensburg, there was an election campaign in 1920, and Flensburg voted in favor of Germany, and north of Flensburg was in favor of Denmark, so that's where we have the border right now, and that was already in the thinking of the 48th. Yeah. Get up and talk to the people.
Yes, but that idea came from a different point, because it was the idea of Napoleon III, actually, who was the peace negotiator after the war between Prussia and Austria, and he had the right idea, actually, to ask the populations of the population of Schleswig. At some point, his biggest mistake, maybe, or maybe it was a trick, I don't know, was that he didn't say when they were going to be asked. So and this of course meant that they were kept in the waiting for decades. And it was only when the Versailles Treaty was about to be signed that things in what is today modern Schleswig followed what there was a situation back in the 1870s where we were given the promise that we were to decide whether we want to belong to Denmark or to Germany. Maybe now the time has come and the path.
Maybe before we have the group photo, we have a friend from the Cologne area, heavily Catholic, but Reppmann had a famous uncle who was very close to little Eric from Schleswig-Holstein, from our area. So what is your impression about visiting from Cologne your uncle in our area, the famous painter Wilhelm?
First of all, I have to add that coming from the Cologne area, don't forget that Karl Schulz was born here in Cologne.
So he's your buddy?
That's my buddy. That's my buddy. That's my 48.
That's why you're famous.
Yeah. And I visited my uncle. He moved 32 Hamburg Fest and 48 the meeting in Frankfurt. These ideas were still living over all this period of dictatorship and all the German history and also the Danish one, constitution and monarchy. There were a lot of steps where the ideas of these 48ers were still living, also after the Second World War, and I would say also today.
Thank you very much. Like in Kennedy's statement, he's talking like a professor, and one of these days he might be a professor at Wartburg. Is that right, Gerald?
I got the honorary award. That is enough for me.
Okay, let's have the group photo. You see that we have the picture in the background? Yes! And we place them in the middle because this is the revolutionary flag. 1848, the Black Night of Tyranny, the red blood of the battles to a golden future of an American Constitution that was in the mind of Hans Reimer Clausen. So we have Dan immediately in between Martin and Dave, and then we have everybody else too. If you are a role model, you start, otherwise you are not encouraged to go behind them. There, behind them.
Good.
Not in front.
Good. I know. I didn't. Yeah.
So everybody is joining Dan now for a group photo, and I have a camera. And everybody gets the group photo.
Daniel, come on.
A nice memento of the opening. Eric,
What we can do without the sales.
yeah. You sit down here.
That's right. You work hard.
Antje, ja. Herr Professor Ripley, you are best looking.